The first European universities emerged at the beginning of the High Middle Ages, offering courses in the liberal arts and advanced professional training in theology, law, and medicine. A medieval scholar might have described the study of the liberal arts as a necessary precursor to what academics now call critical thinking. But it could be argued then, as now, that a university education was the best way to get a good job. And we might consider critical thinking as merely another name for indoctrination. In fact, the word for most advanced university degrees, a doctorate, shares the same origins as the word indoctrination. In this presentation, we'll examine the reasons why we go to university, and whether, as the higher education industry claims, a college education actually increases what some people call human capital, and thereby productivity. When Europeans eventually reached the Americas, they took the land in the name of God for their kings in accordance with the doctrine of discovery. Once again, indoctrination was clearly in evidence. The universities of the first settlers weren't all that different from those of medieval Europe. They functioned as finishing schools for young men of quality. Long after the first universities in the New World were founded, and throughout the first half of the 20th century, a university education was almost unheard of in Canada, except in theology, 1663, medicine, 1833, and law, 1853. By the middle of the 20th century, religion had lost out to economics as the primary force behind our Western universities. Theology has all but disappeared in most universities today. It has been replaced by engineering, accounting, and the sciences. The sciences include economics, sociology, anthropology, political science, management, and the environmental sciences. It seems apparent now that Christian orthodoxy has lost out to a series of warring orthodoxies in the social sciences, each competing for the hearts and minds of society. Indoctrination is still there, but now it's more diverse and inclusive.
It's that time of year once again when high school graduates try to figure out what to do with their lives. In Canada, we are at or near the top in terms of the percentage of our adult population armed with a post-secondary education. The conventional wisdom is that a post-secondary education is necessary for people to develop critical thinking skills. From the perspective of the education industry, a broad general education is a key component in developing a country's human capital. In our view, a college diploma, particularly a bachelor's degree, is just a form of credentialism pushed by our post-secondary education industry. We used to think of education as a public good, but if we consider universities as another industrial sector, students and graduates are the industrial equivalent of customers. In this video, we ask the questions that the news media, society, employers, and universities themselves are beginning to ask. Most stakeholders admit that the primary function of universities is to create a generation of graduates that is job-ready. The notion of creating a new generation of Canadians with better critical thinking abilities may be nice to have, but it sounds more like wishful thinking.
A recent video, September 2024, posted on CBC News website asked the question, is a university degree still worth it? University students across Canada are entering another school year, but are degrees worth the time and money? Taking into account the increasing costs of post-secondary education, we spoke to graduates, professors, and current students about their thoughts on the value of a degree.
At about the same time, the Wall Street Journal noted that it's the time of year when high school seniors start narrowing down the list of schools they want to apply to in the fall. To help with that, out this week is the Wall Street Journal College Pulse 2025, a ranking of the best colleges in the U.S. The ranking of 500 schools measures how well each college sets graduates up for financial success, how much a school improves students' chances of graduating and their future earnings, and balancing these outcomes with feedback from students on college life.
5 years ago, the Harvard Business Review published an article laying out 6 reasons why higher education needs to be disrupted. On the surface, universities are a nice idea. You go in, pick a subject you like, learn from the experts, and leave being job and future ready. This is why so many people, around 40% in rich countries, decide to go to college, even if it means making big financial and personal sacrifices. Yet just because so many people are doing it doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing to do. In fact, while there is generally a cost in terms of employment prospects of not having a college degree, there are not always clear competitive advantages in having one, particularly if almost half of the population has one. The reality in today's digital-first world is that we need to teach every generation how to learn, unlearn, and relearn quickly, so they can transform the future of work rather than be transformed by it. Our education industry has been particularly successful in expanding the market for its services. When I first went to college in the 1970s, only about 10% of the population had a bachelor's degree or higher. Today, that percentage has surpassed 30%. Academics like to equate post-secondary education to investments in human capital, and of course, the much-loved critical thinking skills that the higher education industry inevitably promises for graduates.
According to the IRPP, the Institute for Research on Public Policy, human capital investments yield important social benefits such as increased civic participation, reduced participation in criminal activities, and higher rates of innovation. They go on to say that, with the rise of the knowledge economy and rapid technological change, there is a growing demand for highly skilled, adaptable workers. Empirical studies consistently demonstrate that future growth in GDP is directly related to the knowledge and skills of the labor force.
An international online magazine, The Conversation, brings academics together from around the world. According to them, Canada's productivity is lagging. Economic productivity is a measure of the rate at which the output of goods and services are produced per unit of input, for example, labour, capital and raw materials. While Canada ranks among the top countries to live in, our productivity doesn't even hit the top 10 compared to other countries in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. That productivity grade is a proxy for how well we compete, which is poorly, where productivity is a measure of GDP per capita. Canada is currently ranked 18th. Its GDP per hour worked at 42.5% of number 1 ranked Ireland. Compared to the United States, Canadian productivity has diminished by 9% between 2000 and 2022, falling to roughly 72% of that of the US. They point to the greater number of small businesses in Canada as a percentage of overall employment. OECD data suggest large companies invest more in productivity-improving technology and training, but even then, many of Canada's largest organizations are comfortably part of stable oligopolies, banking and telecommunications companies, for example, with less industry pressure to be more competitive. In a disclosure statement from Queen's University, it stressed that the author of the article does not work for, consult, own shares in, or receive funding from any company or organization that would benefit from this article, and has disclosed no relevant affiliations beyond their academic appointment. But surely the author's affiliation with Queen's University is clear evidence of a vested interest in promoting productivity-improving technology and training, which sounds a lot like getting students job-ready. Concepts like human capital and GDP can be used to prove just about anything. If we plot the number of years of schooling for each of the countries that make up the G7, Canada and Japan lead the way. But when we look at GDP per hour worked, for these same countries, Canada and Japan are at the bottom of the group. You could make a pretty good case for stating that higher education may itself be causing Canada's lagging productivity.
Just a quick note about the data. The educational data was sourced from the OECD, while the GDP per hour worked was taken from Microsoft's Copilot AI service. We accepted those results since they aligned closely with earlier OECD data. We then took the liberty of multiplying the number of years of education from each country by 5 times. In that way, the scales were similar, which highlighted the almost perfect inverse relationship between the two data sets. In fact, if you look at the most productive countries in the world, Ireland and Norway dominate by an enormous margin. But just how useful is that measure? Ireland is home to Microsoft's head office, and Norway derives fully 20% of its GDP from North Sea oil. There are pretty clearly artifacts in the way that GDP is measured that have an enormous impact on productivity in both Ireland and Norway. If instead you look at total factor productivity and ignore the oil industry, one recent Canadian study showed that Canada's productivity is actually higher than that in the US. So, what's up with that? Do we need to disrupt the business models of our higher education industry? Is it time to consider innovative ways to increase the productivity of our education itself?